It is billed as a workshop, so we are doing a number of presentations in which my colleague here, Anna Rowlands, and Olivia Wilkinson, Atallah Fitzgibbon, and Fernando Espada will each be making short presentations which are provocations to our discussion. We are reflecting on locating faith engagement in humanitarian practice and local community response. And as will become apparent as we go through, we're trying to help us navigate this field together. We're trying to create a framing and opportunity for dialogue between academics, practitioners of different disciplines and different orientations, different cultural contexts, to understand how we might more effectively coordinate and be literate in understanding each other's languages and meanings and behaviour. So we will have short presentations. Anna will begin with a broad overview of what we're aiming to do here. And then there's going to be 3 periods. Just to warn you, I will be asking you to turn to a neighbour and just to share in 1 minute, 2 minutes, just privately, any provocations, any reflections, any thoughts in terms of what has been shared. And then we'll have a time of quickly going around the room sharing some of those insights. And we'll do that 3 times, which will take us to 4:15 and our tea. So very pleased to welcome Anna Rowlands.
So this is the extrovert session where we make you all talk to each other, so you've been warned. So my task really is to set out the framework for the Religious Literacy Handbook that we have been working on. It's not finished, so we're trying out the initial framing with you, and then the idea is to get some responses and some engagement from the people who have done key research who will follow later in the session. I should note before I start, thanks to various people in this room, you know who you are, who have either been interviewed for the handbook process or have helped with contacts or etc. So thank you to you in anticipation. So, some opening comments. Implications for humanitarianism of the changing context of post-secularism. The last decade has seen a major reappraisal of the role of religion in framing humanitarian action, including as a facet of the life experience of displaced persons and host communities. For each of these groups, religion is an everyday and not an exceptional reality. We make no claims that it is a solely or privileged feature of identity, but it is nonetheless a central reality in refugee host relations. And international and national NGOs are not themselves without their own structures of religious and non-religious belief. Reflecting the shift in awareness, a growing number of reports, handbooks and scholarly outputs chart the breakdown of a narrowly secular set of assumptions about humanitarian action and explore both the challenges and the opportunities for engaging religion well in humanitarian contexts. In preparing our handbook, we are drawing on the best of the recent research available to us from other scholars and practitioners, and are presenting the research findings from our own refugee hosts' work. This shift in awareness of the role of religion in displacement comes in the midst of a more general contemporary cultural reappraisal of religion. A widespread assumption in the West that secularity equates to a neutrality of worldview has come under increasing strain. The belief that secularism is primarily a procedural reality that secures neutrality by refusing privilege or group hegemony has been challenged on the grounds of the evident programmatic drive of some forms of secularism that seek the exclusion, the eradication, or subordination of religious groups in public life, creating not the absence of hegemonies, but new forms of power relation. Secularism is also challenged on the grounds that it tends to operate fundamental belief claims of its own, that divide the world into binary operating spheres of public and private, thus directly contesting and disciplining the identity formation and beliefs of many outside of a white Protestant-influenced Western liberal system of ideas. Thus, in a variety of ways, we can say that secularism itself is not neutral, nor is it without its own history of religious formation and propositional worldviews. Its historic formation as a doctrine exists within the frame of post-Reformation European Christian religious influence and its developing liberal legacy, not therefore solely outside the legacy of religious ideas. However, it is also clear that the secular values of the last 200 years are not necessarily to be simply othered, merely reversing a binary of othering, but rather might be situated in a complex, plural landscape of worldviews that shape the space in which humanitarian response to displaced persons are negotiated. Put simply, we might say that secular and a variety of religious and non-religious beliefs will be present at any humanitarian table and should be recognised as such. Equally, the rise of post-colonial studies and the demand to pay greater attention to colonial structures of thought has pushed for a reappraisal of the narrowly racial, religious and historical identity constructs that have supported the production of post-war humanitarianism. Simultaneously, we have witnessed within the sphere of the life of nations the politicisation of both religion as a facet of identity more generally and especially as a facet of the identity of refugee populations. Such politicisation of the religious identities of refugees is part of a developing political narrative of fear and securitisation affecting refugees and host communities globally. The traces of such securitisation and fear are widely represented in our interview data across field sites. It is also true that humanitarianism itself is also becoming politicised in new ways. The space for humanitarian action is caught more and more in the net of increasing securitisation of refugee response. Those we interviewed in NGOs and faith-based organisations continually referenced this reality. Interviewees talked of, quote, the shrinking humanitarian space in the context of increasing need for refugee protection and assistance. Fear of criminalisation of faith-based and secular humanitarian responses was frequently voiced. At the level of practice, the widespread adoption of the localisation of humanitarian action and leadership agenda has brought with it a necessary recognition of local faith actors as complex and important agents of, and not mere beneficiaries of, international humanitarian response. This has been a global process with discrete national and regional expressions. In its regional and national forms, this move towards recognising local humanitarian agency has also been bound up, as we've noted already, with social cohesion, integration and harmonisation social policy agendas driven by national governments. NGOs, faith-based organisations and local faith actors find themselves newly at the intersection of localisation and social cohesion agendas. The push to move from humanitarian to development language with a greater focus on the politics of place is, in some instances, reshaping local faith-based responses, and in others, finds a kind of model in well-established work within communities where organisations already accompany local host and refugee populations. For many local faith actors, a holistic attention to locality has long been their hallmark. Equally, there is also some suspicion and concern among all groups about the politics of social cohesion. In the context of both the localisation agenda and social cohesion agendas, faith groups themselves report to us that they can feel variously empowered, enabled, recognised, vindicated, but also co-opted, stigmatised, bled dry, squeezed out, criminalised and misunderstood. From the perspective of international non-governmental organisations, Religion remains a complex factor in displacement, and confidence in handling it well does not yet appear high. From the perspective of international faith actors and local faith actors, their own religious identities remain both vital to a self-perception of the distinctiveness of what they do, but also a cause of some difficulty in the negotiation of humanitarian relationships. There is increasing belief in the importance of understanding and working with religion and faith, but little confidence on either side that religion is yet a factor or a reality handled well in humanitarian responses to displaced persons and host communities. That this situation must begin to change for the benefit of all is generally well recognised. This itself is a significant shift in perception. So that's my sort of very introductory framing stuff, which is kind of what we'll say a version of in the opening of the handbook. But there are basically now 4 claims. Thank you, Alastair. I can take Alastair everywhere with me. Sorry, Alastair.
I know
Didn't check whether you're up for that. So there are now 4 claims that are foundational to our handbook that we want to kind of test out on you. So I'm going to name them and then very quickly illustrate what we mean, and then I'm going to define a little bit the way we're thinking about religion. So the following claims are foundational to this handbook. First of all, the ubiquity of belief. We have conducted our research on the assumption that all organisations work with worldviews, beliefs, values, visions, a conceptualisation of the human person and of the social whole. Faith-based organisations are not exceptional in this regard. Secular organisations operate with inclusionary and exclusionary beliefs and practices. Such worldviews may be largely implicit or partly or wholly explicit, but it is impossible to operate without sets of core beliefs. The question then becomes one of awareness about one's operating beliefs and the dynamics of power, inclusion and exclusion that attend such operation. Our second assumption, or claim, is for religion as contextual and non-exceptional. In our interviews, we sought to view religion as a contextual factor rather than as an abstract or exceptional category that can be thought about and handled aside from a wider consideration of the context in which faith finds itself alive. The 3 countries in which we conducted interviews related to religious identities in faith in very different ways, and what we learned was strongly contextually embedded. Religion cannot be extracted as a factor for generic consideration or evaluation. It is performative within a context and remains so. The opportunities and challenges, whilst having some commonalities, were deeply marked by social, political, economic and cultural contextual realities. The third claim, the relevance of time as well as space. For these reasons, and because the context for persons displaced from Syria and Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan changed significantly during the course of our interviews between 2017 and 2019, we've attempted to be attentive to questions of time as well as space. Whilst we wanted to map clearly the relation between different stakeholder groups and draw conclusions for good practice and mutual learning, we have also wanted to be clear that attention to temporality, relationships set in time, is critical for any sensitive handling of faith in contexts of displacement. Decolonising humanitarian thinking requires us to think carefully about how protracted displacements and multiple intersecting conflicts come to shape the history of refugee lives and of local community responses. The history of violence and loss negotiated by refugees and hosts is, as our interview showed, long in the making. Thinking about relationships set in time also helps to mitigate against the tendency towards viewing faith action as taking place in a separate sphere of action, in zones of separation of every kind from mainstream humanitarian response. And then the final sort of headline assumption or claim, the importance of humanitarian action being informed by wider contextual analysis. It was also clear to us that much of what we were hearing about faith and religion in our interviews fitted with broader findings in humanitarian research about the need for better contextual analysis in humanitarian settings. Religion operates as one multifaceted factor within a thick contextual analysis. Interviewees from local faith groups and faith-based organisations expressed a core concern that many secular humanitarian organisations do not consider deep questions of power and of participation as part of their own evaluation of their own action. Better contextual analysis and clearer attention to questions of power and participation were clear and far from unique findings from our research, and I know Olivia and others have deep and long findings in similar ways. Listening to religious actors raises questions not only about religious literacy in a narrow sense, but also critically about really standard, banal questions of power in humanitarian work. So my final slide, and then you get some other people talking, is basically outlining how we have thought about religion so that we're being kind of transparent about that. So in the sections that follow, we address religion as a factor in displacement that views religion variously as an everyday part of the identities and systems of meaning for displaced persons and for host communities, a causal factor in conflicts and displacement, a system of formal and informal humanitarian care and response, a system of cultural meaning making with texts, traditions and practices which shape response to trauma and provide sources for interpretation, resistance and healing, and which shape views of the meaning of time, space and place. We view the strengths of local faith actors as humanitarian actors as rooted in the longevity of presence in communities, including a commitment to future presence. Secondly, the established relationships of trust that local faith actors often have in localities. The benefits of scale. Local faith actors often have capacities for deep, slow accompaniment work that larger organisations lack, as well as a quick response to immediate material needs. The specific capacities and expertise that faith-based groups have developed over time and are able to offer to communities. In our interviews, faith-based organisations and local faith actors felt that their expertise related to relationship building, education and psychosocial care especially, although not exclusively, and the capacity to build common projects between refugees and local hosts over time. With opportunities come challenges. Local faith actors can exclude as well as embrace. Local faith actors have their peripheries and their margins too. Informal leadership can be as important as formal leadership, and there's obviously a gendered dynamic to that, and this can be harder to identify. The time and relationship building capacities of smaller scale local faith actors can act as a limitation when the scale of need is so high. Here, it's often understandable that there is resistance to the scaling up of local faith actors' operations. The primary function of a local faith actor is not typically humanitarian in the narrow sense, although usually includes some facet of humanitarianism. It is often difficult for local faith actors to meet various standards and protocols that are set by actors outside of their context. Again, back to the question of expertise, etc. This limits opportunities to bid for funds and to manage monitoring and evaluation. The values frame that comes with working with larger secular INGOs can be a barrier to collaboration for local faith actors. This can be about perceptions and misperceptions, and again, I've been strongly influenced by Olivia's work as well as the findings from our own interviews in this regard. Mutual literacy in worldviews and core values can be low, and that emphasis on mutual literacy is something that will run right the way through the handbook. And then finally, many myths circulate in the field about the risks of partnering with local faith actors. Accurate information and testing the validity of concerns is necessary and can be problematic. Olivia has a significant body of work on this, and I have some data on it from the interviews as well. So I'm going to hand back to Alastair now. I will reappear for a very brief moment afterwards.
Thanks, Anna. So this is not the religion slot in the session. Religion has been involved in the politics and poetics as we've discussed. It was in the tracks under the tank as the spirit rose. It was in the opening keynote as we discussed the potential of the abandonment of enlightened presumptions. It was in the words of the song Freedom we heard yesterday, where they sang, "Our families in the camps are feeling pissed off, only God can understand their situation." It has been at the margins, it has been within our discussion. And what this session is all about is attempting to focus on that for a short while to understand our position with respect to that thread and how we might link it into our wider thinking. I like diagrams, and so this is an attempt, and I'm happy that this be abandoned by 4:15. This is a little bit of the pathway that we're on. This is what I think Elena would call a multi-scalar analysis, is that we want to be rooted in refugees and hosts and their experience. And we will be talking a little bit about that and the role of religion and faith within the refugee experience and the hosting experience. But we also acknowledge, as Anna was talking there, that much of what we're involved in is understanding at a community level the operation of civil society in terms of supporting humanitarian action, both religious and secular in these contexts. And then clearly we're also aware that for many of us that have influence on or work for humanitarian agencies across cultures and settings, the global humanitarian regime sets an agenda, sets frames, creates powers and inclusivities and exclusivities. And then by no means last but not least, the context where this play out, the national, regional politics, hugely influences our understanding and the expression of religion. And so our understanding is that if many of us are navigating around these stakeholders or these groupings, we need some sort of map to help us. And this is not a map that will give us detailed instructions from get to A to B. It's the sort of map that might help us to understand some of the issues that we might experience in this area. So what we're going to be doing over the next 66 minutes is sharing some data and sharing your experience related to these various areas of experience. That is the plan. Now, if I just explain a little bit about how I come to this, I'm enjoying joining up these two bubbles because these are the two bubbles I've historically worked in. I was talking to Sarah a little bit earlier on about this book, which is my bravest attempt into social theory. It's a late Habermas, Charles Taylor homage to understanding the complexity of the humanitarian regime, which essentially asserts that humanitarianism, for all the good it does, also serves to privatize religious experience by privatizing, and the assumption that it is a private experience and not in the public sphere. By doing that, it largely marginalizes it from many discussions and actions, and at best, and it's a poor best, actually instrumentalizes it as a tool for the operation of others. And so that's understanding something of a background to the idea of secular framing being enforced on humanitarian strategy and engagement, a certain way of understanding. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of the maturing of the humanitarian regime to cope with plurality and diversity. But the other area of experience, actually working with Atallah and other colleagues, sorry, I had to press another button, which for me connect, you may have, some of you will heard me speak briefly last night about this connection of the theoretician, the researcher, the study of, and the experience of. So this is a tool to support the development of more faith-sensitive practice in humanitarian context, particularly around mental health. And it's not theory. It's very much grounded in the practical experience that documents religion in many circumstances, but by no means all, as an active and effective source of coping in many humanitarian contexts. So there are at least two discourses that I'm in touch with that I can talk about. It's not my job to do so today. And what we're going to try and do is to explore them a little bit, but to connect them, to think of the connective actors and the connective dialogues between them. Now, we're about to go into the first burst of your reflections, and to do so, I just want to share a little bit of data at this lower level, and you may or may not have picked up on the sophistication of the ellipses and their connections. So this could be one ellipse, because it is refugee hosts. They're connected. So I'm going to structure slightly what I say around some of our interviews with refugees, where the discourse of religious belief and affiliation as an experience shaping exile and loss and narratives of agency and resilience are predominant, but I also want to talk about shaping understandings of welcome and solidarity. And at least a couple of the interviews, you'll see both of those superimposed. And I anticipate for many of you, the quotations that I'm using will be commonplace, but it's just to mark that this is language that we hear when we're engaged. And now I want to thank Rana so these are just some short quotations for our discussions with refugees. And I want to thank Rana for a statement she made yesterday morning, which shows some of our challenges in this area, where you interjected, I think, very helpfully in a situation and said, I quote you, "This was nothing to do with religion. It's because we're Muslims and this is the way that we're taught to do it." Now, from my formation, that's quite a difficult thing to pass, that, well, being a Muslim, that is a religious affiliation. And it's certainly true that in many contexts of our interviews, religion is not on the surface very strongly. It is embedded and it is rooted. And there are many quotations that just hint at it, like this first one. We keep to ourselves now. We are much less alive than we used to be. I have to say, I pray to God that this country is protected. Now, I was saying earlier that in the West, God help them, I hope to God this, is almost secular language. It doesn't mean anything. But in other contexts, it hints at an engagement. It hints at a reliance. I do want to share a story of data collection in Kurdistan where, as a social scientist, we asked people, or our researchers, our local researchers asked people, in these particular situations, who do you turn to? That was the question. And it created a problem for the researchers in terms of the tick boxes that they had, because 80% of respondents said God. And the first reaction of the Western trained researchers was, no, but other than God, I get that, but who really? That's the framing that we come to it, that it doesn't mean anything. Whereas for these women, it was a profound statement of the centrality of that. And there were other resources. But even worse was in the NGO report commenting on this and saying, actually 80% of people reported this, how can we present this data to DFID in an appropriate way? How can we let a donor know that it is a spiritual engagement that people... How interesting that the filters that we have... So there are many quotes where God is just dropped in there, embedded. There are others, the second one, there are not so many of these, where clearly religious engagement has been a central part of the formation of a sense of engagement. The spirituality of co-worship, the sense of commonality. The mosque has brought me close to the people, and the role of worship and engagement in that has a profound influence. And then just very much to reinforce the refugee hosts theme, this third one, this is a refugee talking about their understanding in this current situation. But in talking about the engagement of being a refugee and in their own spirituality, it turns to expectations of hospitality and their own experience of hospitality, and using hadith and using other reference points is to say there is this religious saying and another, meaning that Arabs and Muslims are one and therefore we need to help one another. And that was something that was claimed as a refugee, not offered by a host, because they're one and the same, and that was that experience. So that's the sort of data that I think validates that there is something important going on within this area. I want to thank Kathleen for studying this bit of data further that I think is really quite important in this data. This does not come from the main data set, this comes from work in northern Iraq that Kathleen is currently engaged in. But by having a sort of a session on religion and promoting our engagement with it, which we clearly are, this is not to promote religion as a panacea, it's to be very critical of this. And so Kathleen's data is some of the most profound of the burden that religious belief brings to those who have suffered, in this case, under the occupation of ISIS. And there is something in the struggle. I could have chosen quotes of people saying, I am no longer a Muslim, that there is that. But this is almost more painful, that this is my identity. I pray to God, but this is too hard for me. I have been abandoned in this way. And to understand that when we think it is not a sticking plaster, it's not a panacea, it's part of an identity that is wrestled with in difficult circumstances. Still, if I don't pray, I feel like I lost something. Okay, just briefly then into the hosting narratives. And it was mentioned, I think, yesterday the number of times that scriptures are used. This is not universal across the world, but in the data that we have, when we were talking about hosting, it was very common to have the hadith from the Quran mentioned in one form or another, the Prophet being hosted in the town of Medina when seeking refuge. And we have this quite nice description of a young woman who was teasing Syrians in the area for their dress, and the teacher that reproved them and said this was not how you should treat. And so it is being used with authority over behaviour and respect and sentiment. And it is accepted by the young woman as part of a religious understanding and obligation to accept that respect. We felt ashamed that we treated them this way, and then we did otherwise. And we have echoes from other faith traditions as well. For me, some of the most interesting, this is very much more in the theological exegesis area, which I wouldn't normally get into, of how the same scripture is used in different ways. And I have a slight smile on my face from thinking of arguments I've heard amongst Christian groups about hosting refugees and which scriptures are used and how they are interpreted. So I think it's just fascinating to see how the same scripture, the same sentiment is then interpreted in three different ways. So the first one, there is a hadith, the believers in their mutual kindness, compassion and sympathy are as one body. When one of the limbs suffers, the whole body responds to it with wakefulness and fever. It's important to note that the Prophet said believers, not just Muslims. Anyone who believes should receive kindness, compassion and sympathy, even if he's a Buddhist. That's the inclusive understanding of that scripture. Then another one that comes up naturally. Religion has always instructed us to host those in need, especially if we have language and religion in common. So we then have a boundary more explicitly put there, that we have this sentiment, but the sentiment extends to here. And then we have, it's important to note that the people of Mecca didn't overstay their welcome. They were hosted temporarily until they were able to get their lives in order and become independent. So the hadith is being accepted, but it's being seen it was an exceptional circumstance, the way that the Prophet was accommodated. And you should not presume upon that. So this is theological reflection within communities in terms of the meaning of those principles. Right. I'm just checking what my job is now. Right, so we're just on time. Some reflections around this. What my task, I think, of you is turn to the person next to you, and I'll give you, we've got time, 2 minutes, not going to have a lot of time, and I'd like you either just to share something that any of those quotations in this area, we're going to work our way up the diagram, so I'm interested in, at the level of experience, anything that this reinforces, anything this provokes in terms of your observations or experiences, and then we'll just have a quick popcorn around the room sharing some of that. So turn to your neighbour, 2 minutes around religion, faith experience in the narrative of refugees or hosts. Can I just ask you to share something, just a brief comment, maybe what either you were saying or actually what the other person was saying. It's sometimes good to hear what the other person in your pair was saying. So Aiden, you have a... That's fine.
You were speaking about the, thank you. You were talking about how to present or represent what you have as data to DEFID, for example. And you were wondering how to include the findings that you have. And I was wondering, why don't you include a Muslim scholar amongst you in order to give another spectrum of analysis, another lens in order to explain whatever you can't really explain as a Muslim from within the communities, as a Syrian scholar, as a Jordanian scholar, as a Kurdish or Iraqi scholar. The other thing is, you were speaking about the Kurdistan issue, where the local assistants couldn't really understand why some of the participants said that they're not Muslims. The power relations, I guess, would play a role in that. I mean, if you're a Muslim and you're being a bit careful about not being accused of being a member of ISIS, you'll definitely say that to an English scholar or to a Christian scholar. So this is, again, another point. The third point we were just speaking about is you probably don't know how the Arabic or the Arab countries are, the construction of the Arab countries and the embedded religion within our communities. So a Christian friend and another Muslim friend would discuss things and speak about Allah, which is God, the same way. So my Christian friend would say, Salli al Nabi, which is peace upon the Prophet. And it's completely normal in our society. So that's another thing we were discussing. So I think the local experience of scholars is very important in this context. Thank you.
I can follow that to the original work in Kurdistan where there was a it's really helpful. Towards the back.
And just to say that in Canada, the whole business of how the role that religions play is very strategic and very pan-religious. And so it is deliberately done that the Catholics and the mosques sit down together and support the LGBT refugees. So it's deliberately, strategically pan-religious. In other words, it's not divided up, it's across.
Anthony wants to say something, I think. Yes?
Thank you. One of the things that I've been hearing since the panel started is the sort of interchangeability of the words religion and faith. And for me, I separate them slightly differently, religion being sort of organized practices in a sense, usually under hierarchical or religious structures, etc., whereas faith might be both personal and community-based. But I think the dynamics are different, and I'm not sure, I'd be interested to hear from those of you that have been working on this, whether you see them as interchangeable or whether you see some separation between them, because I think a lot of these issues might relate differently if one uses different words to think about the associated social structures.
I haven't read his book, but I have it recommended. His name is Taha Zaman. He's at the University of Sussex, and he has a number of publications about Islam and refugees and how we look at them in terms of refugees or hosts. So his voice would have been a great conversation in this kind of context.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your ambition to look at religion in a contextual way, but I think somehow you also seem to highlight, like was said earlier, religious belief, religious identity. So I'd like to push you a bit on this contextual understanding of religion. So what does that mean, and what does that mean in terms of working towards a more epistemic diversity, probably in what religion is and what it allows. So maybe rather than being concerned with how you can present this or that to DFID, or how we handle religion, it's more thinking about what religion in its diverse ways, pragmatism, materialism, etc., allows us to understand. So the philosopher Achille Mbembe has worked with this idea of religion or religious traditions as magico-poetic. So it's something that allows, conversion is a transgression of boundaries. So how can we include some of these different epistemical way of understanding religion? I think maybe it's not very easy, but I think it's important. Thank you.
We'll probably move on. Just one yes, I'll come to Kathleen, and I just want to explain one thing. My quick anecdote explaining religion to be clear, and that's not a major ambition, it's an illustration, and I want to do almost to austerity, I think. The organisation was blind to it because of a number of filters that we cannot talk about that with someone further up the line. That's what it's not a formal proposition of how to do that. It's just noting that there is so much self-filtering of the language, that there is something quite important happening with a certain population, and others make decisions about how others want to hear. And I think that's very resonant with lots of things we've been talking about. Kathleen, quick comment, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think the important word here and that you're talking about is humanitarian context, not theories of religion and context. Because I spent 10 years in that in that tension between trying to do humanitarian response in places where religious populations are being trapped in the secularized worldview and the reality that DFID funds me. So the reason why that's relevant, the structures you were talking about yesterday, if you're trapped within the two and you want to represent the dignity, the reality, the voices of the population, and you have to ignore and actually exclude something that's, if it is central to the worldview, and you have to put that aside, how are you not causing harm in that way? So the relevance here, just want to say, it is real, and it's painful and difficult for practitioners, but even more so for the people that we're representing in this room, in this conference. So just want to bring it back to that grounding of the reality of what it actually, in the operational sense, why this is such a key issue.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I hope you get the idea of the rhythm. So we could have huge discussion about that, really helpful interjections. We want to move on, but it's not moving past. We will gather this, and this is, as Elena has hinted at early on, for much work, this is engagement early on in our consolidation of ideas, very much to have you as a community to help us shape it. What I want to do now is to move us a little bit further up into this area, thinking about engagement with civil society. We're going up the board, and I'm going to, and we'll eventually be talking about these other areas. But I want to invite Olivia to come forward to share something of her work in South Sudan, but more generally relevant to this. Thanks, Olivia.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. So as we go up to this next level of civil society, I would like to discuss a little bit more about faith actors and local faith actors. Thank you first to the organisers for a really great event, and I find myself not so much uncomfortable, but definitely motivated to keep reflecting and pushing myself and changing our practices for the better. So I work at the Joint Learning Initiative, the JLI, and my work bridges between research and practice on a daily basis. I very much see myself as a researcher first and foremost, but my work is highly action-oriented and working with and for a wide range of humanitarian and development organisations. So I'm in a slightly unusual space in that way, kind of a little bit between lots of ideas and lots of different structures and frames of thinking. There's almost too much to discuss in this short time, but I'd like to offer some reflections on very practical aspects of considering faith and humanitarian response that we have experienced recently. So I will do a bit on terminology first, as we were discussing. So faith actors and local faith actors. At the JLI, we've started to use actor, as it allows for a broader spectrum of groups instead of, but including, local faith communities. The term used in the Global Compact on Refugees is faith-based actor. We had a conference about 18 months ago in this very room with several of you here today as well, to discuss between academics, practitioners, what we could put forward as recommendations to UNHCR about phrasing and the way they could discuss faith in the Global Compact on Refugees. And one of the things we talked about was this move away from saying faith-based organisations, faith communities, to say actors. That was one of our suggestions, and it was quite nice to see that terminology shift in the GCR. Faith-based organisations is still a commonly used term, and we use it mostly to refer to the institutionalised international faith-inspired NGOs. It does not include that broader range of faith actors. I also note that the other term that we hear a lot from, say, development organisations are religious leaders. So all of a sudden we've shrunk down to a very specific range of people there. And the reason why we say faith for faith actors is that allows a broader spectrum of interpretation. Religion, religious leaders, that's very much connected to the institutions that they represent. But again, that's why we often try and move away from saying religious leaders, because that's really limiting who people are thinking about and what they're talking about. Of course, recognizing that we need to think outside of those leadership positions to the informal leadership and some of the things that Anna's already mentioned. For this presentation, I'm going to be talking about local faith actors, or LFAs. Of course, we must also question the term local and the local. What we find is there are many levels of local, both horizontally, vertically, from national entities to very grassroots. And that locality must be further specified rather than used as a throwaway term to say everything that's not the international. So we try to do that, but I still use the phrase local faith actors just for the purposes of keeping the conversation going now. So I'll use two examples from two different countries. The first is from the Philippines, which is my own research, and the second is from South Sudan, which is actually coming from various different research projects, one with Dan Church Aid, another called Bridging the Gap with Islamic Relief, Tear Fund, Redar, and with Emma Tomlin at the University of Leeds, and myself and her lead on the research there. So the first one is I'm going to think about the Philippines. So in the Philippines, I was looking at the work, part of my research was looking at the work of sisters, women religious, in their response to Typhoon Haiyan. They had very small operations, but they really gave definition to this term accompaniment that we've already heard mentioned. Their accompaniment with communities meant that they knew people's names, their trials and tribulations, and the community dynamics and the power structures in that community. But their methods would also be sometimes controversial for humanitarians, the humanitarian system. They do not always go through processes of beneficiary selection in a formalized humanitarian manner. They side with the people they live with, taking activist positions if needed. They have certain beliefs, particularly connected to reproductive health in the Philippines, that are quite different to some humanitarian positions. And they give money for rebuilding churches, providing Bibles, providing rosaries. These acts, together or alone, would raise quite a few red flags for many humanitarians, and they are conceived as challenging to the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality. But in discussions with different communities, community members where these women worked, it was affirmed time and again that people valued this accompaniment. Even when they received less in material terms, they valued it more than the 30 or more, in some cases, international NGOs that had passed through their towns. So now jumping to South Sudan, there's so much to say in each place, but I'm just picking some interesting examples. So a recent report from USIP, they did a religious landscaping of South Sudan, and they affirmed that trust and authority held by religious institutions is important in the country, but it was not tied to national level structures. Because people have moved around a lot internally and across borders, it was very related to area-specific and even really quite personalized relationships, rather than having some institutional structure that then went down through national to local levels. So the main point here is that generally we find that a lot of the humanitarian and development organizations do have some type of knowledge and experience and relationship with a local faith partner to some extent. But they will only be a handful of default partners sitting at the national level, for example, a national interreligious council or something, based in the national capital, that become the kind of go-to arbiters of humanitarian faith relationships in that context, and that's something that we see in South Sudan. We don't see, therefore, who are on the peripheries, who have not been allowed into those interreligious councils, not even interreligious or different types of councils, why they've been excluded from these groupings. The default local faith actors that know the humanitarian system and have learned and have taught themselves how to work with the humanitarian system have a certain amount of control in this regard, but at the same time they are still instrumentalized, as Alastair is bringing up as one of the key points of the effects of the secular humanitarian system, instrumentalized to be this kind of point of community engagement, and used as brokers for all relationships across all hierarchies and structures of churches in South Sudan. So The research with Dan Church-Aid was looking at this concept of the triple nexus and localization. The triple nexus is very jargony. It's the link between humanitarian development and peace work, so that there's a move away from very siloed work and a move towards bridging between these things. This has been tried for many years, but we particularly looked at it in relation to what does that mean for local faith actors. This report was just launched on Wednesday, so come and see me if you want to know more about it. But the findings demonstrated that local faith actors were judged to be honest and trusted by other non-faith-based local actors, international FBOs, and those receiving humanitarian assistance. However, this came with problems, namely their untrusted position among secular international actors. They had to prove themselves to an extra extent, that they were complying with donor requirements, that they had sufficient capacity, and understood the humanitarian rules in general. In interviews around the world in various different places, I can generally tell when I'm speaking with someone from a local faith actor type organization how close they are to the humanitarian system, about when in the interview they say to me something along the lines of, but please understand that we're completely impartial in our work, we don't do this based on, we don't discriminate, we make sure everyone's involved. And that's almost to me like a sign of we're passing through a gate. That at the beginning of the interview, it's demonstrating to me that they judge me as part of this humanitarian system and they need to affirm to me that they are abiding by the rules and playing the game. And so sometimes my heart drops that we've had to, that I'm viewed in that position. I have to, have the reflexivity that goes with that. But then I also think, well, okay, we're passing through this gate now. Let's see if we can get to a little bit of the nuance behind it and understand why they felt that push. And that's, for me, one of the ultimate signs that there is this secular humanitarian system, that every time you talk to the local faith actors, that's almost one of the first things that comes out as part of the conversation. The thing that comes up with this triple nexus, humanitarian development, peace, and the thing that I'm concerned about for the way that local faith actors are instrumentalized by the humanitarian system is that there's a focus on peace when it comes to the faith part. And we already see in the Global Compact on Refugees that the way that it's phrased as who are the faith-based actors is that they can be particularly involved in conflict prevention, reconciliation, and peace building, as well as other relevant areas. So it's already been marked in that global document that the faith actors are the ones that can deal with the wicked problems, the root causes. And of course that's worrying because it's not just the responsibility of local faith actors alone, although they can play a role, when there are a myriad of other structural concerns there. The other point there is who gets to define what are the other relevant areas, who gets to define what's relevant when it comes to the areas that local faith actors can be involved in. Okay. So I'm going to skip over one point there and I'll go to the last point. So this other project that we've been doing is the Bridging the Gap project. So the whole idea is that there's two-way capacity sharing. Again, very jargony term, but rather than having capacity building of local faith actors where it's very top-down and these are the humanitarian rules that you must learn, the idea is to say, well, the humanitarian system has something to learn as well, which is this mutual literacy that Anna has already brought up. Now, when we proposed to local faith actors in country that there would be capacity building for them, there was a rush. We had no problem kind of getting people to come to these trainings. However, when we proposed to the humanitarian community that there was going to be trainings on local faith actors and localization, we didn't even dare mention religious literacy, even though it was that kind of training of sorts. It was very hard to get people's attention. There were definitely key people within organizations that knew that it was important and went out of their way to be part of that. And we also saw a difference between doing the training in Juba, where there was a lot of interest, but interest, but then people didn't really turn up, and then doing it in a more regional outpost, where people really did turn up because they were the ones that were more regularly working on a daily basis with local faith actors. So anyway, we've had a lot of learning about that. We're going to be writing that up soon enough. But it's definitely still an uphill battle for people to recognize that this is going to be something that could be of worth within their work. And so then just the final point is that we've also been thinking about different principles for how these big UN agencies, various big international NGOs can think about working with local faith actors to move away from the status quo that is instrumentalizing towards a more kind of aspirational, participatory future. We've been doing this within the context of a project with UNICEF, but I won't go into too many details with that. But I just want to leave with some of the principles that we've been thinking about. So one of them is moving from the status quo that's project-based, vertical, and siloed to a more community system strengthening and sustained approach. Another one is a move away from a focus only on high-level formal religious leaders who are mostly male to a more inclusive, equitable approach that also engages informal, traditional leaders, especially women and young people. To move away from these default partners that are part of pre-established relationships to look at broadening relationships through doing better formative research and the contextual analysis that you've been talking about, engaging whole of community through a plurality of non-faith, faith, and traditional actors as well, and then moving from unchecked power imbalances and subcontractor relationships with local faith actors that are the ones that instrumentalize local faith actors to more participatory analysis of these power imbalances and joint decision-making relationships. And this is overall, some of these are very important for localization in general, but then there are some of these nuances that are particular to working with local faith actors as well. Okay.
Thanks ever so much, Olivia. So we're about to go to another area of popcorn where you have been provoked either to identify resonances or challenges. Anna's going to share a little bit of reflections regarding secular actors within civil society.
Just very briefly. So much of what I would want to say on this is a little bit framed in my introduction, so I just want to do two things briefly. One is just to go back very, very briefly in 60 seconds to the question people were raising about religion, faith, and language, just very, very briefly. I think that there is a problem with the language, but I don't think we fix that problem by just tying it down really neatly. I think it's a collective problem. It's a problem that is generated from within the West, and it becomes a collective problem because of dynamics of power and colonialism. And to my mind, I worry about a move that simply tries to make religion a public thing and faith a private thing, because I think, in fact, that intensifies the logic of secularization or thought about secularity that comes from within a particular context. I don't think it helps us solve that problem. So I suppose I want to say that religion and faith, it comes to us as language within secularity, within a construct of secularism already. We have to use that language, but I would rather we used a plurality of words rather than a binary or a hierarchy, and in search of better words and words that come from without, outside of, with some externality to that tradition. So I just wanted to say that quickly on the definitional point. So what I was actually meant to talk about is briefly to say something about secular groups. So I started off sounding like probably I had a bit of a downer on secular organisations, because I was arguing that there was a kind of failure in terms of religious literacy, but I want to turn that mirror back very slightly to honour the interviews that we did in Turkey. And Aidan and I went to Istanbul and to Ankara, and we did a series of about 14 interviews, which were slightly tricky to do because of the context, ethically possibly slightly dubious, but anyway, but they were really important to us because they put the lens back the other way. So we were interviewing, of course, faith actors, but we were also interviewing secular civil society organisations. And those organisations, the secular organisations in Turkey, talked to us about their own shrinking space, about the way in which they themselves were seen as suspect because of the values frame that they brought. So they were very conscious of working with assumptions about value frames. And that meant that, in a sense, constricted and restricted their own spaces. So I want just very briefly to share two things from 2 different sets of interviews with those groups. The first is that out of the kind of sense of a constricting space and a view from outside that they themselves were value-laden organisations and those values might be problematic, those organisations talked a lot about trying to find participatory and mediatory approaches, and the language they often used was around participation, peace-building work, and highlighting through research inequalities as a particular focus. So they felt that what they could do was, on the one hand, to produce research in partnership with others that focused particularly on inequalities and measures for participation, and that they could offer spaces that could be convening and hosting spaces. So they themselves were utilising notions of hosting, convening as one of the limited powers and spaces that they felt that they could occupy. And I felt that was interesting. So I want to say just very briefly 4 bullet point things about what came out from those more secular interviews. Firstly, an awareness even within those secular groups that there are no pure spaces, even for secular groups, that their own values space is perceived as just as political. Secondly, lots of secular organisations in Turkey and elsewhere talk to me about the desire to learn how to speak one language rather than 2 humanitarian languages, so a language that would apply and register within a faith world and one within a secular world. Although I was thinking so much during Yusuf's session before and elsewhere that it's about the plurality of language, really, probably, rather than sort of swapping a binary world for a singular one. But in terms of what interviewees said to us, it was about a deep desire to try and find one language. But for that language, that common humanitarian language that bridged secular and faith perspective, that it needed to be co-founded spaces. That was a phrase that was used over and over again. How do we co-find those spaces? How do we negotiate those spaces? And it's not clear that either secular or faith-based organisations know how to do that co-founding. Also, and this echoes Olivia's work, a strong desire was expressed for an accompaniment model of working. So rather than training on religious literacy, which can have its place, what was expressed to me from both sides was how can we learn from each other and how can we have mutual accompaniment spaces in which we learn together to do that deep contextual analysis as a performative thing. The desire for critical, constructive conversation was there again on both sides. And one of the things that was said to me by faith-based organisations who wanted to work with secular organisations was, okay, but who's going to accompany us in critique of our own work? Who do we trust to do that when we think that people don't get where we're coming from? We're desperate for doing that critical, constructive work, but there's a lack of trust about who is able to partner with them in that process. There is still, in the secular interviews that we did, a tendency for the secular organisations to equate religion with vulnerability, so to assume that to talk about religion was really to talk about vulnerability criteria. So trying to find a way in that doesn't use vulnerability or identity as the only way of thinking about religion. And also both sets of organisations, secular and local faith actors, wanted to find ways to contest the social cohesion language whilst also honouring a commitment to deep place-based ways of working.
Thank you, Olivia and Anna. So you might want to choose another partner rather than the person you spoke to 20 minutes ago or half an hour ago, but encourage you, again, in terms of those 2 presentations talking at that meso-civil society level, what resounds with your experience or what contests or challenges your perspective and experience. Just 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. So we have microphones coming around again. Very happy for you to share. Can I send one person right to the back? We'll come to Sally in just a minute. Well, actually, let's start at the front then. Sally.
Yeah. Actually, I have an anecdote, a real one, that the Swiss government appointed a spy in Islamic relief in Geneva, is headed by Hani Ramadan, and this spy should report every week to intelligence whether there is a bias against in beneficiary against non-Muslim. And after a few months, he realized that there is no bias at all, and he ended up by converted to Islam. This is a real story.
Okay. Thank you. Rana.
That's a good story. Okay, so I have a quick, first, this is controversial. What is it? Being uncomfortable. I think Anna mentioned or somebody, about peace, humanitarian, and development, the triangle. And to me, it's like whenever we talk about religion, faith, whatever, the word peace always comes out, and nobody talks about justice, as if you always have to forgive. But I think you cannot forgive if you don't have justice to uphold. No, I'm not pointing, I'm just saying that we need to bring this into the conversation as well about justice. So that's one point. Another point is when you talk about faith-based actors, for using the word that you're using. And I cite Sabah Mahmoud's work, where she worked with a lot of faith-based females in Egypt and other places. We know in Syria there's a whole network. But also we don't bring these up. And to me the question is, and I'm speaking on what would be in the mind of a typical Syrian or anybody. Why should I feel that I have to explain to you how, you meaning the West or UK, whatever, how I operate to help myself? And why should I trust you when you are the ones who bombed me to start with? How would I distinguish between you, the humanitarian, and you, the government, when DFID is both? Right? So to me, this is a huge point that we have to call out. And my last point is we're living our lives again in the way we live our faith, which is different from how the West lives their faith. And then the West comes over because of power dynamics. They want to try to understand us. So they bring their framework. Imagine a ruler. They put it on, they put names, and they see after a while that doesn't work. They bring another ruler, put it on, and we have to suffer this manipulation, which, whether we like it or not, it messes us up because you're still trying to figure things out with the power dynamics. And so, so these are just the points I'm going to bring up.
Thanks so much, Rana. A couple towards the back. There's a gentleman here. Sorry, just the man here with it.
Thank you, Giuliano Fiori. I appreciate Olivia's point about the local and the way that's problematically defined. But even when it's problematized, we fall back into the language of the local and the local actors and localization without even thinking that something is being localized from what? From another local, from the provincial, from the international. And I think there's a series of cognitive constraints and also sort of epistemological assumptions that underlie that turn back to the language. And obviously that language has a certain social and political meaning that has to do with frontiers. And I think when I return to the point about the difference between religion and faith, I think there's other things that we need to consider. Are we talking about dispositions? Are we talking about religiosity? Are we talking about belief? And when there's a generalization, I think actually the point about the ubiquity of belief, sure, that's true, but it could also be so true that it's banal. And I think we need to think about the frontiers between here, the self and other, between the mundane and the transcendent. What is it we're trying to cross when we're talking about the local? And probably there's something about culture here and there's something about power as well that needs to play into that.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. There was one more, I think, just across the aisle. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So my question, I think, is to Anna. So I found it really interesting that obviously people from both sides were saying we can't find one space to talk to each other. And obviously it's because this whole society is very divided, and we know that's based on the secular religious ideas. But at the same time, if we frame it that way, I feel like it's just too binary. There are so many actual distinctions between secular NGOs as well, which would never call themselves as secular NGOs, by the way. This is how we define it here, but actually NGO sector in Turkey would not differentiate as secular versus religious, even though obviously some of them are certainly religious oriented, but that's not how they would define themselves. And I think we should listen to the way they do it as well. And I think we just lose the diversity in both. Just how basically, not just because they compete for funds with each other, but they're actually really different from each other. Their ideologies are completely different among secular NGOs as well, and as well faith-based organizations. So I think, I don't know, I just feel like it's too dualistic at the moment, and we have to find another way of maybe thinking. But also just, we have to listen how NGOs also define themselves, and this is certainly not the way they would do it. Yeah.
You do want a quick response, Anna, and then we'll move on.
The question about how organisations define themselves and there not being clear lines is true across all three countries that we worked in. So it's not something that either would be unique to Turkey. It's true in all of the contexts we worked in. We were aware that we were laying on top of people to some extent a framework of definition, which is uncomfortable, and we should at some level be uncomfortable about lots of organisations that are not an Islamic organisation. I'm not, I'm working in this context in this way. Where possible, we have tried to work with the labels that people gave us. And finally, I think it would be untrue to say, and I wouldn't want to be heard to say, that there are no spaces where people can meet together. It was a more nuanced claim that people were making, which was for mutual critical accompaniment. So who do I trust to critique my practice and to give me a level of evaluation and insight? So how do we do that together? Not attend just training workshops where we learn about a list of things, but how do you do that thing in time where you talk through and you learn together? And that was the bit that people were saying to me was absent.
So we're going to get that. Thank you so much for the introduction. We'll have a final discussion coming up shortly. A lot of discussion there around this meso level at civil society. A small defence of the overlapping ellipses, which are really important. There's a tension here between anything that pretends to try to explain or provide a framework where there's a line, and then the contestation of that line. And so I think we're wrestling with creating an order where there is disorder or there's certainly complexity that gives us some insight into the things that we should be aware of, not prescriptively, but in terms of being mindful of what we should look for. Clearly, we talked about this meso level being influenced by macro level things, which we're going to have in the last two presentations. Really pleased now to invite Fernando forward to talk a little bit regarding the engagement.
And thanks for the invitation to participate today conference, these 2 days, and also to collaborate with the project. So thanks, Elena. So my name is Fernando Espada. I work in the Humanitarian Affairs team in Save the Children UK, together with Giuliano Fiori, and previously also with Stella Carpi and Jessica Field over there. So I guess that means that I'm here representing the global humanitarian regime. I've been asked to give that perspective. And my starting point is a report that colleagues from Save the Children, Plan International, and World Vision did a couple of years ago with children in Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh and in host communities. So my colleagues wanted to hear directly from children about their experiences, about their day-to-day, about their hopes and the things that they would like to and the lives that they would like to live. And surprisingly, children told my colleagues that they were concerned about safety, that they had limited opportunities to play and to learn, that they often felt sick, and also their families, and they not always received the proper care. And also my colleagues heard that that reality was even far harder for girls. But interestingly, and this is what I think makes this report interesting for this discussion, is that children in refugee camps and host communities also said that the call to prayer brings them joy, hope, and a sense of familiarity and hope. They also said that they feel safe in the mosque, the same way that they feel safe when they're in school or when they are at the health centers. Because, and I'm quoting, no one say bad things to us. No one tries to hurt us here. So mosques, schools, and hospitals are places where children feel safe. And children in both communities even said that being Muslims, sharing that same religion, gave them hope that they could live together peacefully and in harmony. So it was, religion is so central for Rohingya children and children in the host communities that my colleagues decided to tell the story of children using the 5 daily Islamic prayer times. And I truly recommend that you read the report. It's called Childhood Interrupted. So there is a second part in the report, which is more the usual, what you usually expect from an NGO report, where my colleagues include a recommendation under the headline cultural sensitivity. And they said, I'm quoting, they recommended to develop approaches to ensure meaningful involvement of religious leaders and mosques, which are highly regarded by both refugee and host communities, to capitalize on these spaces and organize leadership within the communities to enable more impactful programs. So when I read this report, I tried to find out, so what happened with this recommendation? And what happened is this something that not just these three NGOs, but the whole humanitarian community followed? And reading the joint response plan for the Rohingya humanitarian crisis in 2019, which is the coordinated strategy for the Bangladeshi government and the international humanitarian community, the way they translated how important religion is for children in these communities was to categorize these issues on cross-cutting issue, the commitment to include religion in nutrition surveys, and to promote new community representation models within the camps and the camp management. I mean, I understand that response strategies and this type of documents are usually very dry and that they don't capture the complexity and the richness of what aid organizations and communities do. But I felt a bit underwhelmed and disappointed. It didn't feel like the right response to what children said. And that takes me to one of the key ideas in previous presentations and the work that you've been doing is that, yes, the global humanitarian regime is built around secular principles and a worldview that is largely blind to religion. And if we continue reading documents, key documents, for example, the UN resolution that set the rules of humanitarian coordination globally in 1991, well, you won't find a single reference to religion or faith. But fast forward almost three decades, religion is still virtually absent from most important reform initiatives. Somebody mentioned localization, even the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, the Grand Bargain, or even the core humanitarian standards. So for example, ALNAP published recently a report called More Relevant, 10 Ways to Approach What People Really Need. And I thought, let's see what they have to say about. And I'm sorry, I'm not picking on blaming anyone, any of the authors of these reports. I want to be clear. I think all these reflect wider issues. Well, there's no single reference to religion or faith, even though they acknowledge that there are still blind spots in the collective understanding of needs, and that who is offering what shapes which needs are assessed and how. But interestingly, there's another report done by a different organization to know what people in the field think about the Grand Bargain, which is one of the perhaps the most important system-wide initiative in the humanitarian sector. They interview more than 3,500 people in Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Lebanon, Somalia, and Uganda. And they didn't ask a single question about religion or faith. And that report is one of the most important pieces of information for donor governments. There isn't a single reference to religion. So it seems I'm not even committing to, and I'm quoting again, a comprehensive, inclusive, holistic, and dynamic understanding of what people need. would allow for a proper consideration of the religious identity of millions of people globally. So while I was trying to prepare for this presentation, I came across the work of Charles Taylor, who you mentioned before, and I found interesting how Taylor defines the secular age. He talks about the retreat of religion from the public sphere and the use of reason, to the decline in religious belief and the increase in the number of people living their lives without practicing religion. And when I read that, I said, well, it's true. But then I thought, well, it's true for me, for my own identity, for the place where I live, for the fact that I'm a European, white, middle-aged man. But it's not true. It's not the reality for millions of people in many other places with different identities. And it's certainly not true for the children that we interviewed in the refugee camps and in Bangladesh. So what could be done? Well, first, I think we should interrogate and challenge the dichotomy between secularity and religion. And I thank Giuliano because he helped me understand this. And I think we should challenge this dichotomy between secularity as expression of rationality and religion as expression of irrationality. Because, well, it's not true. It's not. It's a manipulation of the reality. Yes. Second idea, I think we should challenge also the secular principles of humanitarianism, and perhaps accept that humanitarianism, even the modern expression of or understanding of humanitarianism, is also an expression of religiosity and a continuation of the impulse of helping others, of solidarity. And finally, I would like to propose to also use the third phenomena that Taylor mentioned to describe the age of secularity, which is, well, the same way that most religious people in most countries have accepted that it's possible to live a decent, honest, and worthwhile life without practicing or accepting the authority of religion to organize public life. I think it would be fair to ask humanitarian agencies and the global humanitarian regime to accept the existential value of religion for millions of people. And if we manage to do that, perhaps initiatives like the Grand Bargain or the Nexus, the Triple Nexus, could be more meaningful for refugees and hosts. Thanks.
Thanks, Fernando. Yes, we are. Yeah. So Atallah, we've got to the level in terms of the analysis of thinking about engagement with governments, political context. So over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to approach this. Alastair asked me to talk about this space between governments, religious communities, and humanitarian ethics. So I'm going to approach it through the normative sort of framework of humanitarian ethics, but recognizing that essentially, like all secular systems, they are prone to abuse and misuse by power elites, intellectual elites, in various ways. And I can give some examples of that from recent times. I was in Hungary last year, and I went to visit the mosque to find out what they were doing for refugees in terms of supporting the desperate refugees that were trickling across the border to the European Union. And they said, oh, well, the Muslim community got together, and the Syrians in the community said, we're going to form a delegation, we're going to go out to the transit zone, and we're going to meet them and find out what they need. And when they set off, they were barred by the Hungarian government, or the police, or whoever it was on the border, and said, no, you can't come in here. And they said, why? I said, well, because we're worried you're going to proselytize to these vulnerable people. Next day, or a couple of days later, I was with actually a delegation from the Swedish church, and obviously Christian, and we went to visit some Christian agencies and walked into this Protestant agency, and they proudly announced how they, not realizing actually that I was a Muslim, they proudly announced how they'd been into the transit zone and they'd done so many baptisms, and and so you can see from this example how variously it's being abused and interpreted and misinterpreted and knowingly abused. And it feeds very much into this first theme around understanding the historical and constitutional context, because Hungary is one of those border... I mean, what's interesting about this, every country has a different history with religion. You can develop typologies broadly, maybe based on sort of Northern European Protestant countries, European Catholic countries, post-colonial countries of a particular religion. But what's interesting is everybody has their own history, and in Southern Europe, Hungary had this occupation by the Ottoman Empire, and the Hungarian government is now funding mainly Christian NGOs based on a narrative around protecting its Christian identity, and politically it's being supported by the Catholic Church and other major churches, and clearly some of these agencies were not challenging the government narrative, which was based on prejudice. So this is problematic, but it also feeds into this issue around the locking out and inclusion spectrum, which all across the spectrum, from theocracies through to secular agencies, do exclude, and they exclude mainly on the basis of religion, race, gender, ethnicity, class, education. What we could maybe use as a marker would be law, the extent to which the law reflects one religion or the other, whether it's secular, etc. Constitutional representation. We often think of Britain as being one of the most inclusive, and as a British Muslim I would say yes, we are an extremely inclusive country of religion, but having said that, our constitution locks out other religions. We have in the House of Lords sit the Protestant bishops, not the Catholic bishops or anybody else. And the Church of England is hardwired into our constitution. So it's there everywhere. Levels of integration within institutions, academia, education, civil society. I find particularly one of my bugbears is post-colonial setup in terms of academia, where they create this separation, and imams, scholars, priests are educated in a seminary, and in the university they produce the priests of secularism, if you like, and the two don't mix, and this is really problematic for integration and for knowing one another. And then, of course, power relations, which I've mentioned. The other important thing is to note that this is a dynamic relationship. Certainly, just as individuals, I would say, within the Muslim world, as they grow up, are often changing, adjusting their identity according to global and other pressures. So are countries, and there's a growing sort of assertiveness of Muslim identity in the form, for instance, of Malaysia, which is very much pushing towards the Islamicization of knowledge as a response to the sort of post-colonial experience, and Turkey, which, as you know well, is now being much more influenced by the Muslim Islamic discourse in its politics. But broadly, and actually, forgive me for the arrows because this is dynamic, but certainly this looks like the way the British went, but I'm not sure it would be the way the Muslim countries would go. But the theocratic basis, where some countries have returned to it, such as Iran, moving to those that combine a theocratic basis with parallel systems of law for different communities. And indeed, the sort of Muslim tradition or discourse around pluralism was very much built on the millet system, the system developed by the Ottoman Empire of separate, each community having its own law and living within its own culture and law, as opposed to this type of secular model we often think of. But that's very common in many Muslim countries. And then governments such as maybe Uganda and Philippines and some others that reflect religious values and teachings in their state law, and that can be manifest in the form of sort of the way they treat LGBT people, the way they solve law and order issues. Last night I was watching this documentary about the Philippines and the purge on drug dealers and drug takers, and this head of the police led a procession through his community carrying a cross, and this head of police was known, his nickname was the Scythe, because he literally was cutting the heads, murdering people who were either drug users or drug takers, him and his teams. So this use of this sort of religious symbology for backing certain aspects of the political manifestation of law and justice, through to secular models, which are common in Northern Europe, but actually, as we said, secularism it can be defined in so many different ways. So, what are the power dynamics? Some of them are that a spectrum. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll move quickly on then from looking at this, but I was going to talk about the power dynamics of control and the way governments have responded to the threat of religion and theologies and theologies of liberation by control, but also problematic discourses on integration, which we find in Europe particularly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the humanitarian ethics and the problems they present. The need to balance principles, particularly on the humanitarian imperative. This has been a particular problem in relation to tackling cultural and sometimes religious elements, for instance in Afghanistan, over issues around girls' education. Tony Vauxhall, who was the humanitarian head of Oxfam, talks in his book about the difficult choices they made, and in the end they pulled out from this huge humanitarian program because the Taliban weren't allowing girls to get education, but he was saying essentially that was wrong, and he was saying that you could put a cost on lives against that policy. So this very difficult area that we have to navigate often to do with religious values in the humanitarian space. Respect for religious law and nature of culture and custom, implications for training staff, understanding and respecting opposing viewpoints, ensuring relevance of programming. Implications of religious power dynamics for the rights and protection of minority groups. Mapping the use of aid to further a particular political or religious standpoint. We talked about that in relation to Hungary. Endeavouring not to act as instruments of government foreign policy, mapping political co-option and instrumentalisation. Are we impartial? Are we independent? For instance, the challenges we had as I think the leading agency in Yemen, and we had to make very difficult decisions about turning down aid from Saudi and other UAE sources, etc. And lastly, government control over access and the directing of aid. So I'll finish there and hopefully pick up some of the...
Thanks ever so much, Atallah. No, I particularly want to thank Fernando and Atallah. Your final 2 minutes will not be done here. It'll be done on the way to coffee. And in a way that works, Elena said a couple of times, this is not the end, it's the middle or whatever. That actually works quite well because we do feel you as a community that with which we are engaged. This is early stages for trying to map this area and to populate it. So I think I'm going to volunteer Anna and I being welcome from your emails and suggestions of what you would have said, or indeed an elaboration of what you did say in the coming weeks. I'll do it within the next 2 or 3 weeks before you forget to do it. But that's plenty enough on our trajectory, and it's been hugely useful to have the diversity of discussion. A real thanks also for the panellists that have stimulated us as well. So it's time for coffee.